What is up, my peepholes? This is your guy, Cly, and it's time for a little DIY. The day has finally come for me to make my first dice set on this channel, and if everything goes according to plan, it definitely won't be the last. And because I'm recording this video in November, I thought it would only be fitting to color these dice with pumpkin spice. Anyway, let me get these mass-produced dice out of the way and show you what we're going to actually need. At the very least, for this project, you're going to need resin, a set of dice molds, and some pumpkin spice. I actually found this particular pumpkin spice at the dollar store. And before I go any further, I do want to say that if you plan on pursuing dice making and you want to make really nice, clear dice, avoid this resin like the plague. The only reason I'm using it is because it's what I have on hand, and I found it in a craft store on a huge discount ages ago, and I thought it would be great to have this much resin for practicing various projects, and it's proved to be very cost effective for learning how to make dice. However, I am looking for an upgrade, so if you have any resin suggestions, go ahead and leave them down in the comments below. Now, like I said, this is the bare minimum you're going to need for this project, but of course, I'm going to complicate things just a little bit, and you'll see what I mean in a second. Now, if there's one necessity I forgot to mention in the previous part of this video, that would be a mixing vessel. In this case, I'm going to just be using a 3-ounce paper cup. Also, before I go any further, I do want to say that it's a good idea to wear gloves and use a drop cloth, because things might get a little bit messy, and, well, the gloves are really a good idea because some people have a horrible reaction when it comes to getting resin on their skin. Anyway, back on topic, I need to measure out my resin. Specifically, I need 40 milliliters or just shy of 1.5 fluid ounces. And because I'm measuring such a tiny amount, what I use are syringes. In this case, they are 10 milliliter syringes that I bought online. I got a 100 pack of these on Amazon for about $15, and they have served me well. And to make measuring even easier, I've put a little bit of my resin into these larger syringes that I picked up at the dollar store. Now, like I said, I need 40 milliliters, which equates to 20 milliliters from each of these syringes. So I'm going to take my resin syringe, pull the plunger out, put on the cap so that I don't leak during this step, and dose it straight in. If you're wondering why I'm doing it this way as opposed to sucking resin straight into the syringe, that's simply because this brand of resin is very viscous. I've tried sucking it straight in and failed spectacularly. As an added bonus, when dosing out resin like this, the moment I let go of the plunger on the large syringe, it stops pouring. So I can bring everything right up to the 10 milliliter line, release my thumb, and we are good to go. Now, as an added bonus, these syringes actually lock in a little bit, even if there's air. And as an additional step, I like to burp my syringes. It's not actually necessary. I could just rip off the cap and shoot it straight into there. But I do want to demonstrate for the camera that I have exactly 10 milliliters. So I pull the cap, push out the air bubble, put the cap back on for a moment, and there you have it. Now I'm just going to inject this into the cup and do one more of these as well as 2 from that, and I'll be right back. Alright, I've got my 40 milliliters of resin dosed out. All that's left to do is to add my pigment, in this case pumpkin spice, and to mix it up. At least that's if I was doing the bare minimum. In fact, this is my second attempt at making this video. While the previous dice do indeed look nice, they don't remind me of pumpkin spice. No, they have more in common with the dark brown color of a lot of retro glassware. Nice in its own regard, but not what I'm looking for. And after doing a lot of test pouring with meeple molds, I found something I like. Specifically, I want something between the color of these two, so what I need is my secret ingredient, cornstarch. Cornstarch acts very differently compared to a lot of other white pigments I've used in the past in that it doesn't make the dice opaque. Instead, it makes it very cloudy, and that's going to keep the pumpkin spice from getting muddy. So let me mix things up and I'll show you what it looks like right before I add the pumpkin spice. And here's the resin after I added a decent amount of cornstarch. I actually lost track of how much I used. And if you want to see how this resin looks if I were to add a proper white pigment, well, here's a meeple that I made using white mica powder a while back, and it really becomes opaque. It's also extremely pearlescent when added to another color, like pumpkin spice from my testing, and I really didn't like the way it turned out. It basically just became a shiny brown, and that's not what I'm going for. So now that I've got everything mixed up, it's time to bring in the pumpkin spice. Just a few taps will get us started. There we go. A little goes a long way is what I found. And because the resin is a little bit cloudy and borderline opaque, the color is going to distribute a lot more evenly and not overpower when you fill the mold, like the other dice I showed you. Just about where I want it. Let's add a little bit more. Need to be careful. I have overdone it in testing. Here we go. I'll be right back after I get my color where I like it. And there we go. Now I've got to get this into these little two-part molds that I made a while back, and that's where things are going to get a little more complicated. In order to get this resin into those molds, not only am I going to be using another syringe, but I'm also going to be using a 3 milliliter pipette. Now, in a lot of the dice casting videos I've been watching, this is pretty much what they use, but this brand of resin is way too thick for those pipettes, even more so now that I've added cornstarch, so a little bit of adjustment is going to need to be made. First off, I need to cut off the tip of the pipette right at the 1 milliliter line. There we go. And then attach it to the syringe. That's where this specific style of syringe comes in handy because, as you can see, it has a threaded collar right at the nozzle. And the 3 milliliter pipettes are exactly the right size to fit in there, and voila! I've got a plastic needle on my syringe, which provides me with quite a few advantages. First off, it's a lot cheaper than metal syringes. Next, the channel is a lot wider than the metal syringes because I honestly don't think they could handle this resin. And finally, I won't accidentally pierce my molds when putting the resin into them. Now, like I mentioned before, this resin is too thick to suck up into these syringes, so I just need to pull out my plunger, give my resin a quick stir to make sure all of the pigment is properly distributed, and pour it inside. Don't want to put in too much, but there we go. Perfect. Next, I need to cap the end of the syringe so that I don't accidentally inject any onto my table, or express any onto my table. And there we go. Lock in the bottom, and burp it. Just like before. Get the air bubble to the top. Remove the cap over the cup. Catch any sputters. Yeah, there we go. I've got everything locked in place and good to go. So let's get the cup of resin out of the way. Bring in one of my molds and just carefully inject it. I don't want to overfill so that I make nasty mold lines. And in order to prevent doing that, all I need to do is occasionally pull the needle out of the mold so that air can escape. And then slowly continue to fill. Pull out the syringe. Slowly fill. Pull the syringe. It's already starting to burp back. So there we go. And just continue until I feel or not until I feel, but until the mold is completely full. Check the edges to make sure I'm not leaking. There we go. And once things are done, just fill up the reservoir to make sure enough resin gets in. Now to do this 6 more times. And I'm done. As you can see, this wasn't exactly the cleanest process, hence the dollar store drop cloth, but I can adjust things in the future if I find a thinner and easier to work with resin. Also, you've probably noticed the little meeple molds, and that's what I do when I have leftover resin. In this case, I mixed up 40 milliliters, and a die set takes about 34. And when you take into account a little bit of a obvious overspill, I had enough leftover resin to make 2.5 meeples. And I'm actually a little excited about the half meeple because what I'm going to do is top that off with leftover resin from my next dice set. It's going to look pretty unique to say the least. And if you're wondering why the molds are different colors, that's because the dice molds were made with proper mold making silicone, and I just hammered out a ton of meeple molds using Ugu, aka 100% silicone caulk with a little bit of acrylic paint as a catalyst. And thanks to my pressure pot, the meeple molds have 0 air bubbles. And speaking of my pressure pot, I need to run the dice molds into mine and let them cure for the next 24 to 48 hours. And with this being a pretty dang cold November, I'm gonna say it's definitely gonna be closer to 48. And here are the dice out of the molds, cleaned up and even inked. And if you're wondering about the methods I used to get that done, here's a montage. Now, I'm not going to say that my methods are the best out there when it comes to cleaning up dice, but they get the job done quick. Even better, there is 0 hand sanding. I've heard so many horror stories from resin casters and custom dice makers where they spent literal hours sanding a dice set, whereas I spent maybe 5 to 10 minutes per die. And of course, my methods are constantly evolving so that I can try to get a better finish or less hands-on time with the dice, because the more time I have to spend finishing a single dice set, the more I'm going to have to charge somebody if I eventually plan on selling these. As the old saying goes, time is money. And I would rather spend that time making more dice, more videos, more chainmail, you name it. Eventually, I actually want to get to a hands-off finishing process, but that requires me to remake my molds so that they have fewer flaws in them, and do a little bit more research on vibratory tumbling because that apparently doesn't round edges as bad as standard tumbling. But that's a story for another video. All that there's left to do is to store these dice, and I think I'm going to use another one of those candy jars that I showed you in the update video where I announced this project. So eventually, I want to completely fill this jar with dice sets that I've made in videos, and based on what I've seen with my other jar, it can hold about 16 dice sets or a quarter stack, and it's going to be fun getting to that point. Of course, I think this is kind of plain, and this is where you folks come in, because I've kind of hit creative block when it comes to figuring out what I want to etch on here. However, I will say that I'm not limited to using the hand tools that I showed in my DIY D20 mug video, because I now have a small desktop laser engraver which, while it's not powerful enough to carve dice, it does make really nice detailed vinyl etching stencils, so I can do stuff like this, and heck, I can even use the same stencils to etch the top of the jar with stuff like this. So the sky's really the limit. So if you have any ideas, feel free to leave a comment down below, and if it matches my aesthetic, it just might happen. Heck, if you have an idea for a unique dice set, feel free to leave that down below as well, because while I do have a nice long running list, I'm still about 3 or 4 short of the 16 needed to fill this jar. However, I will say that I would prefer it if the dice would be balanced as opposed to a heavy chunk of material that's going to sink down to the bottom and make it a weighted die. And I think I'm going to wrap it up here because I am currently fighting the urge to rant about some of the obviously weighted custom dice that I've seen online. So, until next time, this is your guy, Cly, signing off.